Today's topic is persuasion and how we can construct a persuasive speech that is effective and connects with the audience. Here's something to think about. Now, I've heard this before, but I want you to take a moment and see if you agree or disagree that all of our interactions, all of our speech is persuasive in one form or another. Take a moment, think about that. Think about even just a conversation you have with a friend. Are you trying to gain their alliance with your viewpoint? Are you trying to convince them where to go for dinner or to a movie? Is there a time that you truly don't have persuasion in your speech or your communication? You can decide on that, but it is an interesting thing to think about. What we'll look at today is understanding persuasion. We're going to take a break from the book because there's some aspects of it I don't agree with, and as I've said before, I don't always agree with the book, and you don't always have to agree with me. What I want you is different perspectives so you can make up your own decision about how to become a better public speaker. We're going to recover some ethics because persuasion absolutely needs to have ethics considered. And then we're going to talk about the psychology of persuasion. Understanding persuasion. Our definition is the process of influencing others to do, think, believe something through speaking or writing. Of course, when you're going to do a presentation, you're going to start off and you're going to follow what we've talked about with building that speech. We're absolutely going to have a written component of it in your full sentence outline, so that way you can draw that information in your presentation. Going beyond the book, that we have to remember that there is absolutely multiple techniques with persuasion, especially use of speech. We do talk a little bit about how the brain processes memories in different ways. Some people absolutely draw upon the visual aspect of it, like an old movie being replayed. Some people have auditory, and other people absolutely have the tactile sensation in memory. So we're going to tie those into how we craft our persuasive speech. Arguments and appeals. An appeal is a request made of another person with the intent of influencing them. Arguments is a reasoned claim, a series of claims supported by evidence. Now, if we go back to Aristotle and we look at ethos, pathos, and logos, these are almost essentially the same thing, but relying a little bit on different aspects of those. Appeals absolutely have more of that pathos, that emotional appeal associated with them. And that's how they will influence you through an appeal. An argument, you're going more towards that logos and maybe a little bit of the ethos thrown in, where you're trying to make a claim and you're supporting it through evidence, through your credibility, and through how you present it. So appeals and arguments, very similar. Oftentimes we have a tendency to go for the appeal more than the argument, because the appeal with that extra pathos in there, that actual emotional connection, makes us feel better. But both are persuasive techniques. This is my big break from the book, because when we talk about persuasion, our initial thought is how we normally encounter it and what we normally practice. Now, Foss offers a insight of something called invitational rhetoric. Let me explain a little bit more. Normally, when we are talking about persuasion in our society, in our culture, we're really looking at conquest, where I'm right, you're wrong, I'm going to show you why. And so we are always in a conflict with other people when we try to persuade them. The next one is conversion, where we're like, I'm right, you're wrong, but I'll let you come over to my side. Once again, this is a confrontational way of looking at persuasion. Benevolent is, you have something wrong, let me help you. And advisory is kind of what we're doing here, where, hey, I'm instructing you, I'm giving you my information, I'm advising you on how to look at persuasion. Now, when we talk about invitational rhetoric, What we're really talking about is taking the perspective of the other person, not just seeing it as what I want you to believe, but what will help you, partially benevolent, but also about being vulnerable, being willing to change my view. So in this type of engagement, both sides have equal power, and it actually ends up with better results in the end. Invitational rhetoric, I'm not going to go a whole lot into it, but that's kind of a quick covering of it. Invitational rhetoric is a totally different way of approaching persuasion versus conquering the other person. So when you're doing your persuasive speech, think about this a little bit and maybe try to work it in there where, all right, how can I truly communicate with my audience? How can I take their perspective? How can I actually come up with a better solution rather than just me selling to you or me trying to convince you? Now, other aspects of it is we have to start looking at the ethics of persuasion, because you are looking at modifying the way a person looks at the world, maybe selling them a product. Perhaps you're looking at changing their political views, their social views, whichever. And there's ethics concerns there, because if you mislead them, if you misguide them, if you take advantage of them, that's unethical. So coercion is one way that we do this, where we try to threaten them, we try to draw up unwanted emotions, force, distorting, and hiding evidence. It's a conscious choice to try to trick the person. It's a con. And these are all bad things to do. So you have to consider that. When you look at it, I'm breaking from the book here, short break, but when we look at this, we have to remember, what is our goal? If our goal is unethical, our persuasive speech is unethical. If we're hiding information, if we're telling them, if you don't support what I'm doing, it's over, the world ends, it's horrible, then that's probably unethical. Actually, it is unethical. So what you want to do is always look at that goal. If your goal is to help your audience, to bless your audience, to give them something to make their lives better, you're going to be ethical. If your goal is me, and I need the money, etc., then you're probably looking at that unethical aspect of it. When we talk about patterns of unethical speech, I'm going to give you kind of a brief history here of unethical speech that actually goes clear back to the Roman times, but we're going to forward it to Germany in the 1940s. When we looked at propaganda and we look at demagoguery, Madeline Klein and Roger Money Cryle, they were psychiatrists, they were neo-Freudian, and what they really wanted to look at is how a speech is put together that is unethical and is absolutely made to manipulate an audience. And what they came up with is three things that occurred in each speech. The first thing is they attempt to depress the audience, make them sad, a negative emotion, an emotion that we don't like experiencing, but it's easy to do. We're no longer as great as we once were. These are hard times. People are no longer as well off as they were. So they depress them. Something has been taken, so the audience has anxiety, they have fear. And then they cause paranoia. Do you know why? Them. They're the ones that are doing it. They are taking this from you. They're the threat. So you've gone from one negative emotion of anxiety and fear, and now you've thrown in anger and hate. Of course, at this point, rational thought is no longer part of the audience, and they go into a grandiose solution where, but I'm here, only I can fix it, only I can help this situation. When you see this format, realize you're being manipulated as an audience. And if you see this in your own speech, realize it's unethical and what you're doing is wrong. So you absolutely want to break from this, because this is a pattern that is commonly used and it's very negative. We touched a little bit on some of the psychology associated with persuasion, And throughout the course, we have talked a lot about psychology and how it impacts our ability to connect with our audience's view of us, that initial, all right, does this person look like the public speaker I'm expecting? Now, if we move into actual persuasion in psychology, we start to see that the psychology is associated with how do we change a person's mind, how do we connect with them, and how do we persuade them. When the book talks about behaviors, attitudes, and values, what it's really mentioning is the concept in psychology of an attitude is more based on experience as a way of feeling and of thinking in regards to someone or something. It's very much on the superficial layer. It is not a deeper one. Now, when we move on to beliefs, beliefs are more closely held. It's more towards the authentic self. It's more drawn in, and it's actually something that we don't have to have logic to support it. We have had beliefs in our childhood about the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and other things that we truly deeply believed in, but we had no evidence. We had no real support of that. So beliefs are a little bit deeper. And then at the very core is our values. Now, if you're going to try to persuade someone and you're going directly for their values, they're going to be very defensive because that is very much a deep part of them. So what you can normally change is more of their attitude. You can change attitudes by demonstrating behaviors, by using logic, through experience, through storytelling. Those are effective. And then if you can change their attitudes, their beliefs slowly start to change, and perhaps eventually their values. So when the book says, oh, you can change a belief easier than a attitude, I don't agree with that. I understand, absolutely, that's their perspective, and you can gain that perspective as well. But I really believe that an attitude is the first thing that you can change with persuasion, and you can do that through your audience analysis, looking like a speaker should in front of them, communicating in a way that connects with them, and demonstrating that ethos and that credibility that might change their prejudice or their bias towards you early on. This goes more into why I disagree with it. And yes, if you look back at some studies, there was Robbers Cave, which is a psychology experiment that occurred in the 1950s. And with that, they actually took two groups of children and basically made them enemies. They were at a similar camp, similar background, very similar children that normally would get along early on. But they managed to divide them through competition and through conquest. And what occurred was a deep dislike for each other. Well, when they went to bring these groups back together, because they couldn't send them home disliking each other, what they found, the only way to do that was to change their attitudes towards the people, to do things that they worked together, where they saw the person rather than as an opponent or an enemy, but instead as a friend and a co-worker. So those are absolutely one of the reasons why I truly believe, yeah, you can change an attitude before you can change the belief. Because those children, it had become part of their belief system that the other side was against them and was bad. Well, only through changing their attitude were they able to change the belief and eventually reunite the children. Throughout the semester, we have been talking about Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, the ethos, pathos, and logos. And we absolutely have to consider these, as we've talked about, when we're talking about persuasion. Again, the most motivational or most persuasive element, in my opinion, is pathos, because pathos is what makes us feel good. And once we feel good, then we throw the logic in there. You know, yeah, I bought the sports car because it gave me a thrill. It was exciting, it's fun to drive, and I just really wanted it, and it really made me feel good. Oh, and by the way, it has a good safety record and a good gas mileage. And wait, do you see what just happened there? That's right. I actually first acted on emotion. Second, I acted on logos, and then finally I could say, and the car is made by BMW, a well-known, well-established car company. Boom. See? Suddenly, that decision was easily based off of first pathos, logos, and then finally ethos. But all three are important to include in your actual persuasive speech. That's the reason why early on you want to get their attention. You want to say why it is important to them, how it will benefit them, and then you're going to throw in your credibility. You're going to say, I'm talking to you today about this because I studied this, because I lived this, because my experience is. Suddenly, you have all three in your introduction. That is a good way to start off your persuasive speech. Appeals to need. This is one of the aspects of if your audience doesn't need it, it's really going to be hard to persuade them. People are motivated to change because of reason and rational choices in their best interest. People want to change because of inherent human needs. That leads us back to psychology. Boy, this feels like a psychology course versus public speaking, but realize they are very much intertwined. Communication goes through all the different sciences and helps us to promote them. As I was mentioning, this goes back to people's needs. So that goes to Maslow, where you're looking at, all right, if a person can't feed themselves, doesn't have clean water, doesn't have sanitation, it's going to be hard to sell them on a luxury item because their basic needs aren't met. So it has to meet their basic needs. And then from there, they have to feel safe. And then from there, love and affection. Oh, wait a minute. Now we're starting to get into where that luxury item might come in. So you have to look at persuasion of, all right, where's my audience at? You know, am I talking to the right audience? Is this going to truly help them? For instance, with college students, yeah, you can easily do a persuasive speech on the need to change perhaps the student loan system, to change how textbooks are purchased, to change something about college life. Yes, they will be very interested in. On the other hand, if you go to a senior citizen center and you talk about the same things, that doesn't really impact them, so they're not really going to be motivated to assist or have their minds changed about it. So consider the psychology as you're putting your persuasive speech together. Another thing to consider as we're putting our persuasive speech together is, yeah, we've really drawn out how emotions and pathos are an important aspect of persuasion. Now, there are sequences or techniques that we're going to talk about, such as Monroe's motivated sequence, where you absolutely have to create that need. You have to get your audience to understand emotionally that there's something missing and that perhaps they can assist, perhaps you can persuade or change their mind about something. So in a persuasive speech, you might start a little bit with an emotional appeal that is not unethical, but it's not a happy emotion. But it's not propaganda. It's also not demagoguery. But you might start off with, you know, is your house not as nice as you want? Is the summer too hot? Is there, and these aren't positive ones, and this is how most commercials actually start that you see in advertising, where they have some type of aspect of, you know, do you struggle to mow your lawn? Is it a pain to? And they kind of throw in those emotional aspect of it. And yes, you can take your audience's emotions down a little bit to begin with, but you don't ever leave them there. You always bring them back up, so that way your solution leaves them on a good note, not lower. So fear and scare tactics, I say avoid them because of the fact they are such negative emotions. It causes anxiety and is not good for your audience. Here's an example right here. You know, it's too late at the siren sound. The bombs are dropping. This is how they would sell bomb shelters back in the 40s and 50s. And for that reason, the audience is scared into your product and they're going to regret it later. And you're not going to leave them in a good emotional state. perhaps even make them worse off when you're done. You always want your audience to be better off when you're done. So watch for that. You also don't want false advertising. All these are unethical things that are tied to emotions. The main thing is, yes, you want to create a need, an emotional need in a persuasive speech, but you also want to give a solution that leaves your audience in a better place. What we wanted to talk about during this chapter is understanding persuasion. I broke from the book in several places. You're absolutely allowed and encouraged to agree with the book. You can agree with me. Better yet, you can find your own perspective. Next, we talked about ethics because persuasion is tied heavily to ethics. And it is so easy to lose your ethics in persuasion. So always make sure that your audience benefits from your presentation, that you have blessed them, you have given them something. And we talked about the psychology, talked a lot about psychology. So these are all concepts that you need to consider as you're beginning that persuasive speech, everything from picking the topic to moving on to putting that speech together. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. Absolutely. Persuasion is not about just changing a person's mind. It's about helping them become a better person.